By the end of this video, you'll know everything you need to know about the Iliad by Homer, what it's about, how to approach it, etc. You can make the case that the Iliad is the most foundational story in all of Western culture. And so the deeper you understand it, the more it's going to color your understanding of other stories that have come afterward. The first part of this video won't have any spoilers. It'll be about how to approach the text and things to be thinking about as you're reading your way through. My name is William. I'm a writer. I wrote a novella called Fumes that I put out about a year ago. This is my YouTube channel. If you get something out of this video, I'd really appreciate a like. The first thing to keep in mind is that the text, is really just a tool for you to get closer to the poem. It's an epic poem. It was told orally well before it was written down. I would recommend against having music on in the background, and I would strongly encourage you to feel out the rhythm of the translation that you're reading. The better the translation, the better job it'll do of giving you that sense of cadence and meter. When it comes to annotating the text, the main thing that I always try to do for myself is be sure I know who's talking in the story. And this is a tip that applies really to any older piece of literature. Well over half of the Iliad is comprised of characters talking, so them basically giving long monologues, and it's not always super obvious who's talking. In Shakespeare, we always get the character's name and then a colon, whereas in the Iliad, often a character will be named and then they'll just be alluded to a couple of paragraphs later when they actually start talking. Oftentimes, this is literally all I'm marking on the page as I'm going along, because I find that it helps to read a poem like this at as fast of a clip as possible so that I can kind of stay in it as I'm going along. There are a ton of names and a lot of details in the story. My advice on your first read through is to not get too bogged down in understanding exactly who is who, because if you're Googling a lot of this information as you're going along, or you're getting hung up on not understanding whether someone is an Achaean or a Trojan or whatnot, it's gonna kind of take you out of the rest of the poetry. Okay, so that's how to approach the text. Those are some tips for reading the thing and getting acquainted with it. There's a lot of historical context that I could go over here for the poem. What I'll briefly outline for you is that the Iliad is just telling a small slice of the story of the Trojan War. So we don't deal with Helen, we don't deal with the conflict first starting. I'll also note that there's a lot of debate around whether Homer was one guy. That's not really important in my view for your understanding of the story. I'll circle back to a bit more historical context after we get through a synopsis of the plot. So starting now, I'm gonna be discussing the details of what happens, why, and what's important for you to be paying attention to. It's about rage, specifically Achilles' rage. That's the entire story. So why is Achilles mad? Achilles is a hero, he's the best fighter in the whole story, but Agamemnon is in charge. Agamemnon, after he and Achilles take a town, decides to take a woman that is Achilles's. And so this is why Achilles is sulking at the very beginning of the story. He even goes so far as to want to sabotage his own side and get the Greek gods on the side of his enemies. Without Achilles there to help, things don't look so good for the Achaeans, and the Trojans start to win. Ships get burned, and Patroclus, who is someone who Achilles loves, ultimately gets killed in the conflict. And this is the event that drags Achilles back out from his tent where he's been sulking about that woman and into the fight again. A guy named Hector, who's basically the Achilles of the Trojan side, is the person who kills Patroclus. And so then Achilles, once he rejoins the fighting, naturally goes after Hector. Obviously, this is just the plot in broad strokes. I'm trying to get through the gist of it as quickly as I can. Achilles then avenges the death of Patroclus and kills Hector. He drags Hector's body around behind a chariot. The gods intervene so that there's not as much damage to the corpse as there should have been or would have been otherwise. But none of this is doing anything to make Achilles' rage go away, which, as I mentioned earlier in the video, That's the entire story. It's all about Achilles' rage. It's not until Hector's father comes and talks to Achilles, which is a big risk on his part, that Achilles has a light bulb moment and gives Hector's remains back over to the Trojan side. It's a little act of forgiveness, and that is ultimately what subsides his wrath, forgiving his enemies and doing something somewhat nice for them. Okay, so that was the plot in broad strokes. Before we continue, I'd like to read you a quote. It's the epigraph of The Secret History. I inquire now as to the genesis of a philologist and assert the following. A young man cannot possibly know what Greeks and Romans are. He does not know whether he is suited for finding out about them. That's a Nietzsche quote. In case you didn't pick up on it from the sacking of towns and the taking of women and the killing of people, the Iliad is a very violent book. Its themes include, but aren't limited to, war, violence, and rage. This poem very much so celebrates the glory of war, and it's extremely gory throughout. However, it's also very beautiful. There are quite a few similes, definitely over 100 throughout the book, that give you these really nice little glimpses into Greek culture and the country and kind of what life was like. I'll read you a quote from towards the end of book 8 just to give you a flavor for how beautiful this poem is. Thus high in hope they sat through the livelong night by the highways of war, and many a watchfire did they kindle. As when the stars shine clear and the moon is bright, there is not a breath of air, not a peak nor glade nor jutting headland, but it stands out in the ineffable radiance that breaks from the serene of heaven. The stars can all of them be told, and the heart of the shepherd is glad. Even thus shone the watchfires of the Trojans before Ilias, midway between the ships and the river Xanthus. 1,000 campfires gleamed upon the plain, and in the glow of each there sat 50 men, while the horses, chomping oats and corn beside their chariots, waited till dawn should come. One novel that I've talked about quite a bit on this channel already that most definitely owes a debt to the Iliad is Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. Both Blood Meridian and the Iliad are extremely violent. That violence is explained in gory detail, but there's a stylization and a balance to it as well that lends both texts enough beauty to counteract all of that violence and gore. While I was reading the Iliad, I never got the sense that there was anything overt about the narration of the poem that was saying war is bad, violence is bad. But the story ends when Achilles' rage is finally at an end. And I think that the story itself is showing us, rather than telling us, the impact of war, both on a personal level and on kind of a societal level. And it's showing us a way out, some level of forgiveness or kindness at the very end of the story. It definitely helps, insofar as you can, to think like an ancient Greek and to read this poem as though you're in ancient Greece. Really try to put yourself there and accept the Greek gods as real. They're very much so characters in the story. The Iliad, along with other poems like the Odyssey, they were basically the Bible of ancient Greece. And in my view, there are some pretty stark contrasts between, let's say, the Torah or the Bible and the Iliad. First of all, in general, the Bible has a lot more parables in it, and it doesn't focus so intensely on war heroes, whereas the Iliad certainly is all about these epic heroes of war and their feats in battle. What does it mean that the central characters in a story that was so central to Greek culture are these agents of war? And what can a story like the Iliad show us about human nature? How intrinsic to who we are is war? These are certainly questions that I asked while I was reading the Iliad. There's some speculation as to exactly how old the Iliad is, but it's definitely over 2,500 years old at this point. My understanding is that the Iliad was more central to Greek culture than the Odyssey was. The Odyssey is really fun. It has a lot of fantastical elements to it. Certainly the retelling in the Sea of Monsters, the Percy Jackson book, helped the popularity of the Odyssey for me. But the Iliad is the place that I would start if you want to study Western culture, stories, the ancient Greeks. Since people started telling the story of the Iliad, it has been extremely relevant, and I don't see its relevance fading in the slightest, especially because of its themes. I didn't study the classics in college, but I did take 5 years of Latin in middle and high school, and I read the Aeneid, which came much later after the Iliad. Some people lump the Aeneid in because it helps with our understanding of Troy overall. Troy might not have even been a real place, although there is a site that has been found that people do think was ancient Troy. This channel is by no means turning into a study of the classics, but I'm in the process of doing my due diligence to fill in the gaps in my own knowledge and to take a much closer look at stories that will always be relevant and that have influenced my favorite writers to a great degree. And so I'm only going to continue going forward in history, and you can expect to see some level of variety on this channel still, but my aim is to start going deeper into these impactful foundational texts and to go into even greater depth on bindery. So I'll be making some extended cuts of videos like this that go even deeper into the themes, that address more of the characters beyond just the core essential few. And I'm having fun with this format. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you haven't subscribed already and you've made it this far in, definitely consider doing so. I'll be making book content indefinitely. Take it easy, and I'll see you in the next one.